Stoga from the Tällberg Foundation, Sweden and New York. I'd like to start by thanking the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for the support to the Tällberg over the last couple of years and prospectively into the future. But I also want to start, since we're going to talk about refugees, I thought it would make sense to bring some refugees into the room, at least briefly, while we're still being mic'd. These first several photos are done by a photojournalist, an Italian photojournalist, Fabio Buccarelli, who has spent the last several years of his life documenting refugee movements. All of these are migrants who have come into Europe recently. And finally, a photo from Lesbos of the life jacket, life vest graveyard. Each of those orange things, each of those black things represent one person who made it to Lesbos and left their life jacket, left their inner tube, left pieces of their boats, although those are not boats that any of us would get on willingly or, I suspect, unwillingly. But does give you a bit of a sense of, if you've not seen, of what the reality is. There we go. Thank you. Yesterday was World Refugee Day, which was something, a new celebration from the last decade as the pace of refugee and people movement has once again accelerated. Current numbers, just to put this in context, there are, according to the United Nations, 65 million refugees today. Of those, roughly 45 are displaced within their own countries. 20 million, however, have moved out of their country, are moving out of their countries. Of that, perhaps 2.5 million are in Turkey, some of which have obviously now come here. Again, some numbers. This year so far, 220,000 refugees, and I'm going to use refugees as a generic concept. Thank God there are no lawyers on this panel, so we're not going to talk about refugees and migrants and displaced persons. Refugees are people who are moving. 215,000 refugees so far this year made it into Europe. About 160,000 of those came through Greece. The other 90,000 have come through Libya. As you well know, the movement through Greece has stopped. The movement through the Mediterranean is now accelerating. 1 in 23 of every migrant that gets into a boat trying to get across the Mediterranean dies. That so far this year has been something on the order of 3,000 dead refugees. That's a number, as a New Yorker, that is important. 3,000 people died in the World Trade Center bombing, the 9/11 bombing, and that changed the world. 3,000 people have died in the Mediterranean so far this year, and I would argue it seems to have changed very, very little. What we're going to do today in this panel is simply to talk about that. This is our living room. We 9 are going to have a conversation about all of these issues. Your living room looks like this, I'm sure, warm, comfortable, informal. And I want to invite you to join the conversation. This is not going to be a series of presentations, a series of PowerPoints. It's going to be a conversation where I hope we will discuss the issues. I hope you will join us. And the range of issues we need to talk about today is prodigious. It's about economic stagnation, it's about religion, it's about identity, it's about demographics, it's about income inequality, it's about seeking a better life, it's about populism, it's about reacting to all of that. It is truly a witch's brew of issues. The title of this panel, as you can't see, asks the implicit question, is this an intractable set of issues? And if so, so what? So let's start with intractable. Robin, you've thought about this a lot. Oh, and by the way, I'm not going to introduce anyone. You have their bios. Please read them. You're welcome to say who you are if you say it very briefly.
Well, Alan,
ball to you.
Thank you for letting me start off this conversation. Delighted we have a chance to talk about this at this SNF Foundation conference. It's highly topical, not just in Europe, but around the world. And you said intractable. Why? I mean, I think from where I sit, I'm the director of Chatham House in London, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. It is remarkable when you go with those statistics at the beginning that actually levels of refugees, as you said, let's not talk about economic migrants for a minute, if we talk about refugees, have been rising at a hugely rapid rate over the last 3 years. We've got about a 4 times as fast rate of growth in refugees now as we did 10 years ago. So that big jump up to 65 million, you know, was 37 million about 10 years ago. The acceleration in the last 2 or 3 years has been huge. If it were going to peak, that'd be one thing. I saw a stat before coming up here, so it was good to do a little bit of research, that only 125,000 refugees were able to go home in 2015. You know, so the number is being added to. I think there's about, to my mind, at least 3 things driving this. Refugees are people who leave because they don't want to leave. So violence is the first point. Is violence increasing? Why? Is it intractable? There's always been violence in the world. We are fortunate to live in the world at the moment where violence across borders doesn't seem to be happening as much as it was in the past, but violence within borders is happening perhaps even more intensely. And if I think about something intractable, there seems to be a confluence between still having many predatory, corrupt, violent governments in the 21st century who treat their population as sources of money or power, alongside a loss of other governments being willing to impose order. So the whole concept of responsibility to protect that the UN came up with 2011, 2010, somewhere around there, has gone out of the window since the Syria crisis. So on the back of Iraq, on the back of Afghanistan, you've got a real loss of a willingness of other governments, let's say externally intervene, and you've still got governments internally that are treating their populations appallingly. So violence is increasing. Combine that with the growth of population, combine that with climate change, combine that with technology, that people can then see how they can escape if they are, and governments thinking, I can push my people out, that might be part of the answer. I mean, I could go on, but I think those are some of the main
But I'm not going to let
drivers.
you. I'm not going to let you go. Just let me come back. Let me flip the telescope to the other way. You suggest that these are one-way flows in the main. Very few people going home, lots and lots more people trying to come here. Myrto, you're at the rock face. You've spent a lot of time in Lesbos, elsewhere in Greece, meeting with, working with, as of some others, refugees. Do they think they're going home?
Well, it's been particular in Greece, I think. I think the Greece experience with which we've been engaged, humanitarian crisis within our border, which has been unique, is particular here because we have been a purely transit country and we still are. So I think members of NGOs...
Although there are 60,000 people that aren't doing much transiting at the moment.
Yes, but they would like to leave, and that's for sure. So I think this has been our experience. I mean, we've been accepting significant flows, over 1 million people in a year when the borders were open. But all of them were leaving and targeting specific countries in Europe. Now we're facing with a medium-term type of situation whereby people are stuck. But I think that's been true, and I think we've had a lot of conversations with Kurt, with them specifically about this.
But they're stuck. Do they want to go home or do they want to go forward?
Well, they want to go forward, they can't, and some of them even want to go home. And this is what we've been experienced. I don't know if this would be the case if other countries were involved. I mean, if Italy can be itself a destination country and not transit. But for us in Greece, it's been purely transit, and I don't think anybody wants to stay here for many different reasons.
Marietta, same question.
I want to answer to that, but I will take.
And I think you have to speak louder.
The fact that we are trying to seek solutions to a problem.
We can't hear you.
Okay.
We have a mic check.
Yeah, but.
It's good.
Okay.
Here comes another
Yes,
microphone.
yeah.
We'll solve it
I have
otherwise.
to stay like this, maybe. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent.
So we have to try to define what is the problem in order to find the solution for the problem. And then we can also discuss of whether the problem is intractable or not. So there are many problems, and we can put them in a series of we can prioritize what are the biggest problems. As you very well mentioned, the biggest problem is that today we have the biggest number of displaced people, 65 million. Most of them are locked in their countries. They wish they could go out, but they cannot. This is the biggest problem, and you have to keep this because it is important for seeking the solution to that. The other problem is indeed that countries, different countries, transit countries, do not want to consider themselves immigration countries, so they do not want to adjust their policies in order to have people staying in these countries, and they rather have an incentive to push people back or push people further on. So that's another problem. The big problem today is that we also do not learn from our past experiences. The migration issue is not a new issue. It has been very, very long time that Europe has been trying to face the migration stemming in with deterrence policies. And well, new problem, we have a humanitarian crisis one country away, very close to the borders of Europe. So Syria is the next problem. So we have experienced what we have experienced. You call it a refugee crisis. As MSF, we do contest severely the use of this term, refugee crisis. Crisis.
Which word, refugee or crisis?
Words do matter, so that's a very good point, and this is a point that I want to raise. Words do matter. Crisis for us is what we provoked, the suffering that we provoked, the intensification of this drama of the people on the people, these people, the refugees themselves. This is the crisis. It has been a management crisis, a reception crisis, not a refugee crisis. 1 million people is nothing, is a very small number. It's 0.2% of the population of Europe. So we could have established a system where people, asylum seekers, could seek asylum in Europe through a safe, legal, organized, systematic way. There are many legal opportunities, legal schemes for that to be a possibility. Europe chose not to do it. Europe, by mismanaging, not managing the issue, I don't want to say the problem, created a big problem.
Well, let's take that further, because you've touched on politics, which is where we're going to get to eventually. Politicians and politics are always the root cause of all evil. From a Danish point of view or from a Northern European point of view, Europe has, as you said, clearly made a set of choices. Europe has clearly said we want a hard border. We didn't want a hard border before, we do now. How do you see the politics, not how we got here, we know where we are. We'll know more in 2 days when we see what happens with the UK, but the politics of creating, as Marietta has just said, of not welcoming refugees in an orderly, systematic, well-managed, administered way has created this sense of crisis. But that clearly was a political choice by a series of actors here in Europe.
No, I mean, it was very clearly a political choice. And I think one of the intractable elements of this crisis is that you have essentially this everlasting conflict between Europe's sort of UN treaty convention commitments that essentially everyone that arrives on the borders of Europe has an individual right for asylum, which is obviously a very live question in Greece right now, and then the very genuine political desire for population and electorates in Europe to control their border. And this isn't going to go away, except that it is de facto going to be solved by Europe essentially de facto reneging on its commitment to essentially giving everyone their free and fair hearing for an individual asylum claim. But I think another, and probably even more important, at least for Europe, intractable element of this issue, whether we call them refugees or economic migrants, is this issue of integration. Because whether people come because they're fleeing violence or they're coming to seek economic opportunity, the reality is that the European economies writ large have done an appalling job of essentially integrating, and by integrating I mean predominantly providing jobs for migrants from other, from non-EU or non-OECD countries, which of course, of which the vast majority of the most recent inflows come. And as long as that persists, we're going to have an intractable political problem that part of it rears its head in the Brexit campaign, part of it is going to rear its head, we saw it in the Austrian presidential campaign a few weeks ago. It's going to be intractable political identity politics as far as the eye can see. So what do we do about it? Well, I mean, from an economist's point of view, it's actually not that difficult. You basically say, look, we have a group of people who either have lower technical skills. If they have the technical skills, they may have lower language skills or social skills or whatever. What do? Well, from an economy point of view, it's very easy. You pay them less. So basically what we're talking about here is, in many people's eyes, social dumping. But the alternative would be to basically have a permanently ethnically defined underclass in Europe. Is that what we want to do? Or do we want to have, say, a phase-in period, a 5-year phase-in refugee, migrant, whatever you want to call it, wage, where you can pay them 60% of the minimum wage the first year, then 70, 80, up until 100. Those are the kind of things that Europe needs to do, in my opinion, to get out of this intractability issue.
Gerry, you raised a question, we were talking this morning about your passport. And this question of who's a European, who's not a European. What kind of commitment do you think people should make when they want to come to Europe?
Well, this morning's been very interesting, simply because my mother is Maltese Italian, my father is Ethiopian Somali, I have a British passport, and I live in Brussels. And I have a serious problem with what's going to be happening in the UK on Friday or Thursday. Having said that, my worry is that we're all dealing and talking about this as if it's a one-off, resolvable issue without serious change. And I think we don't know enough, actually, about the country I was born in, Ethiopia, is actually producing quite a lot of the refugees that are crossing over the border, or Eritrea. And I don't think we know enough, really, about what's motivating, what the networks of communication are, why certain countries are being chosen. I had a conversation very recently with my alma mater, which is the School of Oriental and African Studies, where a group of anthropologists have been spending time in refugee camps in Eritrea and in Somalia and in Ethiopia, to talk to people who have actually tried to make the crossing and have failed. And I don't think we know enough about it. We're not recognizing this as the sort of new normal. And the conversation seems to be about, and it has to be, of course, how do you deal with a problem now? But you also have to be able to imagine what's coming next. What are the next set of issues we're going to deal with? And it seems to me that we've gotten into a very typical process of solving problems by slices, by pieces. And I thought what was magnificent about the opening was this notion that really we are in a Mediterranean basin. I did my anthropological fieldwork, I'm an anthropologist, in Sardinia, in Italy, where when I lived in Sardinia 30 years ago doing fieldwork, there were no African, Indian, Asian people at all on the continent. If you go to Sardinia today and you go to the remote parts of Sardinia, you find Indian, Chinese, African migrants who have been somewhat integrated into the economy. So there are good examples of where things are happening. And I do agree with one thing that you said, which was the integration issue is the biggest problem. My daughter works in Norway. She works essentially with Islamicized youth. And it's one of the biggest problems we have in Europe. And unless we begin to see all of this as integrated and step enough away from it to look at the whole thing, climate change, movement of people, need for people to protect borders, need to prevent people being isolated in ghettos and in ideological ghettos mostly in Europe, we're really going to have a problem. And I don't hear a conversation that's about the future and what are we going to do with the next set of problems. I don't think this is going to end. It's not intractable, but it does need a different set of tools.
Before we get to solutions, I want to get religion on the table. Kurt, you have a lot of experience in the Middle East. We talked a bit about Islam earlier. One of the characteristics of this migration, which is different from some earlier migrations, certainly in the modern period into Europe, is that this migration is coming out of countries which have very different value systems, very different religious systems, very different cultural systems. And there's a lot of experience on this panel with all of that. Kurt, would you like to kick the Islam ball?
Kick this ball. That's a very good... I've lived 35 years in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and worked in Egypt. And my closest friends are Muslims, and many of my closest friends don't speak English. It would have been impossible to live in the Middle East for that long if my neighbors and I didn't love each other, if we didn't share cultural values. And they are just as terrified in general of the Wahhabist type of Islam that has kind of dominated.
Can you put that in context? Give some, not everyone's going to know what Wahhabi Islam is.
Wahhabism is probably best expressed in one phrase: my way or the highway. This is Islam. Cut off hands, we veil women, and it's extremely iconoclastic, which actually is a Greek word. And so there's no possibility for any kind of intermediary, any discussion. It's quite radical in the sense that if you don't follow, then you can't exist. They are the greatest threat to the Sunni population of the Middle East, and most of the people that they have killed have been Sunni Muslims. When I came to the Middle East in 1981, no one had heard of Wahhabism. Now, 35 years later, it is what we in the West think is Islam, and it is not. The driver for
and why is that important?
Because if we think that if you are a Muslim, you are somehow the enemy, or at least our enemy, then we have grouped all of those people who are not Wahhabi Muslims, who are conservative, who like to send their kids to school, they like to buy their wife a new dress, they want to have a better future for their children. They think like good Greek Orthodox, good American Presbyterians, good Baptists. They're kind of like us. So if all Islam is bad, then we've just negated the potential of cooperation with most of Islam. That's very important.
But flip it upside down. What is the impact of Wahhabi Islam on Europe, on this migration? Because if that is the problem, what is the dimension of the problem? Because the point you're really making is we don't think of all Christians as the same. A fundamentalist in South Carolina in a tiny church is very different from a high Episcopalian in England. We know that. We do tend to conflate Islam as Islam, but you're making a point, I think, that Wahhabi Islam is something that is one of the corrosive factors, perhaps, in this mess.
And refugees, I like the term earlier in the discussion, are people who are moving, who don't want to move. I'm a refugee because I didn't want to move, but I have to move. And in great part, those people from Syria who are refugees are refugees from that kind of Islam. Not only, but the great upheavals after Mosul and in Iraq, and that reverberated into Syria, people had to flee or die. So they are running away from the very thing that we are also not for. So they are running to us. There's a mindset that we can say that actually these people are natural allies. We can be friends. Will there be the infiltration, the odd infiltrator? Yes. That's why the UN has a system for vetting refugees. So there are things in place that can do this, that would increase our comfort level. As I would remark just in one last comment, the United States had 180,000 deaths from guns last year. No deaths from refugees or terrorists, outside, other than domestic terrorism. So we carry our own fear that we feed ourselves because of our inability to extend our rule of law, understanding of our citizenship and our shared values. And this has gotten displaced onto the refugee community in some way.
I'd like to go further down that path of integration because clearly that is one of the critical questions. But before doing that, I think we have to go back to Marietta's point about the large decision that was made de facto to not do this well, to increasingly drag our political feet. You explained partly why, but Joel, there's an ethical dimension to this.
Right.
And I suspect, why don't you speak to it?
Sure. Just building on what Kurt just said, the ethical principle at stake here is pluralism. And what Mr. Dracopoulos said at the very beginning of these proceedings and what we heard in the lecture, we do have a history of pluralism to build on. And there is a past to look to. Not to be nostalgic about it, but that principle is there, and that may be one principle that's actually driving and pushing people to move in a certain direction. The principle of pluralism is something that we're proud of in the West, but it's not just a clash of civilizations between different civilizations. There's obviously a clash within our own civilization as well about how to deal with these issues. We had a conversation at Carnegie Council just recently with Ian Baruma, who's a student of some of these issues, and he made the point that Kurt just made, that it's actually not the refugees themselves, but it's the hysteria that they produce, which is something to be really worried about. So I think this is something that bears further reflection. Also the idea that this is a genuinely humanitarian crisis, and we need to think about the common humanity that we share with the refugees. To use an American term, the sort of unalienable rights that people have. And just because people may have lost their right of citizenship and they're stateless people, doesn't mean they've lost their human rights. And that's something that can't be solved by defense.
Let me push back just a little bit, because we're sitting in a country that has seen its economy contract by, pick a number, a quarter, a third over the last 7 years. We're sitting in Europe, which doesn't know how to grow anymore. We're sitting in a space that has huge unemployment, doesn't create jobs. So I wonder if it is, so you have those humanitarian both demands, ethical demands and instincts, and you have some economic realities, and I'm wondering if any of you think that some of that not is justifiable, but is explainable, perhaps, by stagnation in Europe. And then you.
I don't think so much. I think, just to bring it back to the present and actually the locality of Greece, which is what I know best, I think we've failed very much in our response to the influx.
Who's we?
We means, I think, Greece, and it means Europe, and it means all of us in this room collectively. Why? Because even the few, 50,000 people, and I agree very much with the point that Marietta was making, 50,000 people in Greece is a very small number. The conditions in which they're still being kept today, after 4 or 5 months of being here, are appalling and completely unacceptable. And I think that's not...
They should be unacceptable.
No,
they clearly are acceptable because they're accepted.
They're completely unacceptable, and in that sense we've failed. And I don't think it's an economic problem, because there's plenty of funds from philanthropy, from Europe, even within Greece, to deal with the problem. I think firstly, you know, the agreement with Turkey is very cynical, and that's created a sort of very gray legal area where the human rights are not respected, due process is not respected. So in addition to the physical conditions that they have to face with, they're also faced with a complete lack of hope because they don't have any prospect of what their legal exit might be. That's number one. Secondly, there's a big problem with coordination because there is, as I said, I think a lot of funds, a lot of people trying to help, everybody trying to do well, but there's a complete absence of coordination, which means that their immediate needs are not addressed. And I think we have to start by focusing on the micro picture, learning to provide humanitarian response to a humanitarian problem, in parallel, obviously, to trying to analyze, you know, the bigger picture and how in the long term we're going to deal with these issues. But I don't think it's a problem of the economic crisis.
Alan, I would, well, to agree with that point.
And then I want the dismal scientist to talk about the economic crisis.
To agree with the point that Markos just made, I think, and disagree with you, you said, you know, Europe can't grow. Bits of Europe aren't growing. Bits of Europe are growing very well. Europe has 8 of the most competitive economies in the world inside the European Union. It's got some of the less competitive than they should be economies.
How's the average doing?
Sorry?
How's the average doing?
It depends. The average of what? The average is about 1%. If you've got a population growing pretty much flat, actually growth doesn't need to be that high. The US needs higher growth because it has higher population growth. So, you know, I think the idea that parts of Europe are growing in a way because politically and politically economically they've not worked out how to grow. And a critical element here is that Europe is making a transition. It's in a defensive mode. It's making a transition, and we discussed this at the last SNF forum, between it's like a continent that has organized a welfare state approach where those who've got want to protect what they have, and there's not as much room for those who are growing, whether they're young Europeans, never mind young refugees, the youth to have opportunities versus those who've already got the jobs. So when we talk about integration, it's also about how you create employment. America integrates its immigrant population in a way because it's found a way to be able to generate growth at a quicker rate than Europe has been able to do. And I don't want to get too boring about economics here, but I think the fact that Europe has not worked out how to unleash its service sector, that aspect, which is 70% of European GDP, that you're limiting the capacity for employment and therefore the capacity for integration. So I would simply say Europe does have choice over its destiny. It can control its future. They're tough political choices that most politicians have not been willing to make.
I'd love to ask a question which is a different topic of who's Europe, but that's a different issue. But Jacob's shaking his head here.
No, I just want to push back on actually the original point that you made, and actually pretty much agree with what Robin just said, which is that there is no economic argument for Europe responding to the way it has to the recent inflow of migrants. I mean,
to stop it right there then, why has Europe responded the way it's responded?
It's identity
Most
politics.
of you are Europeans.
It's identity politics. It's basically a perception in large parts of the population and the electorate that there is no control over the border. It's not even a numbers game. Net migration into the EU is well over 1 million people every year in the 21st century. It's comparable to the United States. It's the feeling of loss of control that has happened that has led to the fueling of the...
So how does Europe get that? I'm not sure you can have control in the 21st century of anything, but that's my own bias. But how do you recapture, if you ever had it, control over these variables? Anyone? Well, Myrto.
I think the sense of, I think the problems that Europe have been facing beyond financially are critical here. I think the political challenges that we've been facing, the lack of European identity, the fact that we've been challenging, as you've said, I know it's perhaps a different topic you want to get to later, but who are we? What is Europe? Where are we going? I think they're critical here. The fact that we are in such a turmoil, in such a political crisis of what we are, and we're basically disintegrating into a collection of states, more or less, and a purely nationalistic view, each and every one of us, of everything, especially in dealing with this issue, has been key here. And perhaps we had a more coordinated approach of who we are, where we want to go, and how can we deal with this crisis or not. Could be, you know, the timing is difficult. Not to place any excuses here, but I think the timing has been critical here in terms of where Europe finds itself at this particular time.
If governments, I'll just jump in to finish this point. I think if governments cannot give the impression to their populations that they understand how they're at least going to try to manage this huge process of people coming to Europe, and people are going to come to Europe. I think it was David who just said a minute ago, you're at the front end of a huge movement of people, not refugees, economic migrants potentially, coming from sub-Saharan Africa, heading towards Europe. Europe's been living in naive la-la land, I have to say, thinking that some having open Schengen borders internally without having some sort of external system that would give confidence to internal populations has really created a lot of the populism that we see.
And let me keep on pushing, because you started that sentence with the word if. I would answer it by saying I see no movement anywhere at the EU level, at the national level, at local levels. Quite the opposite. I see most politics racing away from this towards nationalism, tribalism, everything you just said, Myrto. Where's the optimism? Where's the leadership? Why? What do we see out there that would expect us to see this begin to reverse itself? Where's it going to come from?
I think it has to come, sorry.
We don't see anything. We see.
Oh, but you have to speak louder.
We see the exact opposite. So, personally, I am very pessimistic, but I'm pessimistic with a hope always.
Hopeful pessimism. It's a new category.
But what we see at the moment is it's an opportunity to mention clearly that what we have experienced is a result, as many speakers explained, of ideological confusion in Europe. We are confused. And that has led to a lack of vision. So there is no vision. And the lack and all the reflexes have been anti-humanitarian reflexes. So there is a very big problem. The values that we promote in our societies at the moment. Now I want to mention that the efforts that we see that are undertaken at the moment, and I will bring the EU-Turkey deal as an example, are really going towards the very, very wrong directions. So what is Europe's response? Is to basically undermine the whole concept of international protection by transferring its responsibility, moral and legal responsibility, to another country by political or financial exchanges. That is very serious. So now Europe is a key player, in the world, is a key regional player, and considers, which is even more severe, that this is a success, and wants to further reproduce this example to other countries. There is a blueprint idea for 16 other countries that include 4 of the major refugee-producing countries in the world: Sudan, Eritrea, Somalia, Afghanistan. Well, we can just erase from the map the word refugee and refugees overall, and have the problem solved. Keeping problems away is not a problem. If we don't bring humanity back in the way we conceive our policies, it's a problem. So maybe we need to think today that one of the reasons that we have collectively, we as the EU and member states, collectively and individually, we need to rethink how to promote in our own societies, first, the ideas of, I will repeat.
This is the hopeful part, I bet.
And then we can only go and do the same outside of Europe, as we ought, instead of negotiating with
I'm going to come to Markos here, but one fact. Spain has had a negotiated agreement with Morocco for a number of years now. In fact, the template for Turkey-Germany was Spain-Morocco. So this is an old, not old, but this is a diplomatic solution to, in effect, export your responsibility to protect to people who probably don't have a robust history of protecting even their own citizens. Markos.
Sorry, I wanted to go back to the question that you asked earlier. Where does the hope come from, and how do we begin to change it? Because it's a bit of a cliche, but I think we change it with the young. And if one sees even with Brexit, you know, the sort of age differences between the people who are afraid or want to vote out and the people that we've seen, because we run shelters for young unaccompanied children in Greece.
Explain who we is.
Sorry,
just tiny
Metadrasi
context.
is a Greek organization that does a lot with interpretation. We have 300 interpreters in 30 different languages. And we also do a lot of different actions for the protection of unaccompanied children. One of those is that we run transit shelters for children in the main entry islands. And we've started running since January programs in each of those where we do joint activities for the children in the shelters with children of local schools or local universities, like in Lesbos and in Samos. And those we see that, you know, if you start the children doing classes together, playing together, doing joint excursions, there's no issue, you know, whatsoever, because they're children, they play, and then, you know, those children, the Greeks will grow up, you know, without having any fear of the unknown and whatever. So I think that's really where addressing the problem begins. Yeah.
Kirk?
I like the word micro that you mentioned. Let me take you back to the Piraeus port a few months ago, where there were about 2,500 to 3,000 people at that time who shared 2 toilets and no showers. And Myrto and I had the privilege of walking into what they call the stone warehouse. And when the refugees discovered that I could speak Arabic, within about 60 seconds, a community meeting happened. And in typical Middle Eastern style, the older men were in the front circle, and the younger men, there was no circle for women, so they were watching from the outside. So I felt right at home. Okay? It didn't mean that women didn't have something to say, but they said it in a different way. Probably the most outstanding point of that time together was they said, we're on our way to Europe, and you know, Greece is Europe, and we thought something was true about Europe that didn't turn out to be true. It's not actually democratic, and they don't actually respect human rights. So here we
The Europeans do not respect human rights.
Yes. So now what do we do? Another comment was, we don't have a voice in what's happening to us. Wasn't that one of the basic ideas of democracy? At least you can have a voice about it. Maybe nobody will listen, but you can at least talk. So from experiences in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Germany, and Greece, refugees are aware that we don't have, our bank accounts are empty, both literally and democratically. We don't have what they thought we could offer. And they accept that. That's the way life is. So can we sit down, and I'm going to put a Greek brand on this. The word that I heard earlier is the xenophilia, the hospitality, the love of strangers. That's a Greek brand. That's a thing about Greeks, right? The food tells you, the wine tells you, the sun tells you. So we can change this by listening, again at the micro level, by listening to refugees and giving them a different role than the humanitarian system currently gives them, which is, you are the object of what we will do. This will not work. You cannot have an answer now from half of the equation.
I want to use that story to pivot to the title, philanthropy, because I had the privilege also of being in Piraeus and in the stone warehouse. And what most struck me, among many other things, was the complete absence of government. That this was not the UN, this was not the EU, this was not Greece, this was not Athens. This was philanthropy, individual philanthropy, collective philanthropy, Greek philanthropy, in a pretty well organized, self-organized camp by some just heroic people. Are we at a point where, whether it's a crisis or not, we've made it into a crisis? Is it philanthropy's role? Government maybe can't handle this. Are we at a place where the burden is shifting de facto, if not de jure? Put aside whether that's good or bad, and if so, what do we do with it? Let's start down there and work back, because everybody, and then Joel after Gerry.
Yeah, I'm privileged enough to see how philanthropy has responded to this, and frankly, it's been extremely impressive how different philanthropic players have come together. I mean, there's the very big project, the EPIM project, which Niarchos Foundation is part of. There are incredible responses, but the thing I really want to talk about is the swimming pool amounts of money that foundations and philanthropy has. So there are incredible things happening, both in terms of very long term, what's going to happen next, as well as how do we deal with the crisis now, happening at a philanthropic level by NGOs, by foundations, and so on.
By individuals.
By individuals. But it's minute, it's finite resources, and in fact it should be.
But we heard earlier that money's not the issue. So money either is or is not the issue.
Well, let me just try and finish this, because actually money is the issue. Because in fact we still have structures in the world that are not dealing with the crisis as it currently is. So one of the other things we need to look at is UN reform. We have to start looking at what does UNHCR do? Why are we so obsessed with definitions and legal clauses and the rest of it? There has to be a moment where we, in meetings like this, start challenging very conventional views that no longer actually have validity. If you don't say that, you're never going to get anywhere. And one of the big problems is that a lot of money is caught up in institutions that actually aren't as flexible, are not as agile, are unable to respond quickly. And if philanthropy shows the way with swimming pool money, maybe governments need to follow.
I would be willing to place a bet that we will not see UN reform in our lifetimes, but that's a different bet.
But actually, I think there is another element.
Unfortunately.
To this. It's not just the UN. I mean, the refugees, the whole migrant issue is a conundrum for the, shall we say, international development industrial complex, the World Bank, the other multinational development banks, etc., because they can't deal with it. The problem that they face is that migrants, refugees, have lousy credit histories. You can't actually give them a loan. And if you can't give someone a loan, well then organizations like the World Bank and etc. can't really be very effective, I would argue. And the big driver of global capital flows, growth in emerging and developing countries, which is private investments, don't really apply either. So you're left with aid and grant financing, which is very clearly the private philanthropic sector, because overall money is not a problem, but development aid is a huge problem, because governments are going to keep cutting that.
Refugees also don't have a voice. So they don't have a voice, they don't have a vote, and they don't have money. Why is this going to change? Unless philanthropy, in fact, takes lead. Myrto?
I think philanthropy has taken a central role, or an increasing role in this particular case, only because civil society has done so. I mean, especially, drawing from our experience in Greece, up until the borders closing and the EU-Turkey deal, civil society, NGOs, volunteers, so many volunteers, so many civil actions on the ground, dealing with the problem, even before the UN coming there or not coming there at all, even before even the larger NGOs coming here, so many grassroots efforts coming in. And I think one of the roles that we have come to play has been to strengthen this, and this is key, and this comes back a bit to your earlier question about what can be done for the future and how can we change all this and negativity and going to the future and as a drive for change of how Europe sees this. Civil society, at least to an extent, has been crucial in this, and Piraeus is a wonderful example of this. Complete absence of the government, complete absence of any central collaboration, a handful of NGOs doing magnificent work and shifting it all. And this is one of the reasons why the way that at least we've experienced this as a foundation has been completely different to any other work that we've been doing. You have to be on the ground, in the field, with them as much as possible to see what's going on, to identify the gaps, to see where the needs are. You have to be proactive purely. And this has been extraordinary in terms of operations on our end as well. But it has all been because NGOs have done such a remarkable work, and because we have been able to support that if you monitor closely enough.
Joel?
I'd like to make just a small but I think important point, making a distinction between charity and philanthropy. And I think both are vitally important here. And what's interesting
and you need to explain what you mean by the difference.
Well, charity would be the relief of immediate human suffering, immediate needs of food, clothing, shelter, and the need to address that and to do it with some degree of urgency. Philanthropy is a broader scale. It's thinking about institutions. It's thinking about social arrangements. It's thinking about how we actually address the problem. And it's thinking in new and creative ways. So philanthropy, it's not a coincidence that it's connected to schools, to cultural organizations, to hospitals, to new ways to improve the way that human society operates. So I do think in looking at an immediate crisis like this, it's important to see it in its immediate terms, but also to be thinking in broader ways and be thinking about new ways of approaching an age-old problem.
Kurt, you wanted to respond. We also want to invite anyone who has a question, a comment. No, that's not true. We don't want comments. We want questions. That sort of push this along. Kurt, and then we'll open, and there are microphones somewhere, and for some reason the clock disappeared, so I have no idea what day it is. Never mind what time it is.
Or what year.
Please.
An interesting paradigm to think about philanthropy is the theory of disruption. And in that theory of disruption, you have an incumbent industry that serves a certain set of customers very well. And you have another segment that is totally underserved and neglected. And the disruptor identifies those people and figures out a better way to serve them, generally at lower cost. So that's a terrific role, or terrific paradigm through which to look at the role of philanthropists, because it requires, to be a disruptor means you have to tread water for a long time. You're going to demonstrate new things. Just as an aside, in the Greek situation, the numbers of young Greeks who get this thing about refugees, that we need to talk to them, we need to listen to them, we need to do stuff, means that you can take both sides of the equation, the Greek side and the refugee side, through that lens of young people who want to work together and talk together. So it's possible, we have more potential for disruption if we can see ourselves as disruptors than perhaps ever than we've seen so far.
Jason, I thought I saw you waving at us. Do you have a question?
Yeah.
We need a microphone and you need to identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Jason Glazer from La Isla Foundation. Actually, per a point Kurt made, I want to ask Myrto a question because you were on the ground. When the EU and the UN made these decisions that have impacted this group of people that are coming through Greece, did you experience a moment or a time of investigation by the EU or the UN or the larger decision-making bodies where they interface with the philanthropists or the NGOs on the ground, or much less, to your point, the people who are being treated as objects, to come up with the decision, the kind of cynical decision with Turkey?
Not at all, and I think it's funny how you mentioned this, because it's been striking, and we've been talking about this morning, it's been striking how in this particular case, at least in our experience, because we look at the humanitarian crisis on the NGO side and we look more into that effectively, and we're working closely with those, but we have a glimpse through meetings and through conversations with members of the UNHCR or embassies, and I participate in these meetings, and I've never seen such disparity between the two. It's like we're talking about a different issue, a different world completely. The two are completely different. So to my experience, I don't know if others can say more about this, because they speak to the national and international bodies more, but I think not at all, and it's just two different worlds, and this is something that we have to change in the future. I mean, any policy has to take into account, to an extent, the humanitarian implications that it entails.
Maybe I'll put the government hat on. It's a cynical deal that had to be done, in the sense that Angela Merkel was the leader who stepped up and said, look, the situation is unsustainable with these huge numbers coming over because of the crisis in Syria, which in a way we in the West at some level have some responsibility for and in. But these, we live in democracies. If you live in democracies and a majority of your people think that you're not in control, you will end up with populist parties. Until governments show that they have some aspect of control, the political situation will worsen. And I have to say, I am concerned about democracy within the Western states as well as I'm concerned about the future of refugees. And the cynicism that's been applied, I think, by governments who've ignored the vulnerability and weaknesses of Europe's ability to deal with migrants and refugees, and two different issues, I think. I keep pointing, we have legal obligations to refugees, and migration is somewhat different. But the fact that deals have been done, there's some breathing space has to be created, I think, by the governments to start to put in place systems to draw people in a way that does not feed the people smugglers, the corruption, and that ultimately is undermining the confidence of people in their governments. So, yeah, bad deal, I agree. Cynical. Is Turkey fully able, although it's taken in 2.5 million refugees, more than we've done in Europe, but is it the perfect place to send people back to? Are some of the other models bad? I'm sure. But governments have got to, as long as they do get control of this moment, work out a layered system where you're involved in diplomacy in the region, where you're trying to help refugees in camps in neighboring cities, where you're actually starting to do a proper ID and processing system as people arrive in countries, and where you do provide a legal route for immigration, because the problem is the link up of immigration and refugees is what's undermining, I think, all the citizens. Until you have that last layer, like America does to a certain extent, where people know they can move and there's a system to get them in, this chaos, the chaos will undermine the democracy that we appreciate so much in Europe.
One could imagine that process could have started earlier, since this is not exactly a surprise that people are trying to come to Europe, as you pointed out with the numbers. Andreas, you have a question. There's a question back. So we need a microphone here.
Hi. Yeah, Alan, you alluded to it at the beginning about the question about politics. And Marietta spoke about this crisis of management. Gerry talked about the large swimming pools, but they're still swimming pools. And it's one thing that we, as a foundation, we always say to internally, we're here to complement, we're not here to replace. So I see us all here trying to replace, basically, effectively, to solve the problem. The question is, can we do anything about the main problem, which I think is lack of leadership in the political arena? Because that all starts from the main conductor. The main conductor is the state, the governments who have to establish the policy. And then we all, in our respective roles, can actually complement in many ways. So it all starts, do you agree, that it all starts from the lack of political leadership and the absence of conductors?
That partly is a rhetorical question, I think, because there is clearly a leadership deficit in the world. There's a question over. Do we have two microphones, or are we going to? We don't have. Microphone's going the wrong way. Why don't we keep one on one side and one over there?
Very good discussion, thank you. My name is Nikos Karalambidis from Greenpeace. I react to the point of Robin. Sorry for Nikos and Robin.
My name is Robin.
Many of us have been discussing about if this cynical deal was a necessary step. The truth is that this step, necessary or not, agree or disagree, has actually reinforced the xenophobic and populistic narrative in Europe. So no matter if we theoretically see it as a necessary step, it worked the other way around. So my question is, how can turn this around? Because disruption can go both ways. Can strengthen the business as usual or go to a better direction. So my question to you, Robin, or anybody else is, what is the step from now on where we stand that we can change this narrative?
So the question is how to change the narrative. There's also, I have to go back, who's we, Tonto, is always a question you have to ask.
All of us, it's civil, I mean, being
we sitting here are partly trying to change the narrative by having this conversation.
Actually, if you hear what we've been discussing so far, is we're talking about the absence of the Greek state to start with, and also we're talking about a European Union, the institution of Europe that decided to step back and reassure that they have control of the situation. So step back, close the border, and by doing that, actually reinforcing a xenophobic narrative. So going the other way around. If this is we, I mean, the ones willing to, could be foundations, could be civil society, could be citizens, whatever.
I would agree that those are all the issues. Jacob?
I mean, I guess I would take issue with the belief that if you hadn't closed the border. We can debate how it was done, but I am quite sympathetic to Robin's point that this had to be done. Because we're talking about counterfactuals here, and the counterfactual, if you had let inflows continue of the magnitude that you saw late last year and early this year, that the xenophobic reaction across Europe wouldn't have been much higher than it is today, I think is just not credible. It would have been much worse. That's my basic point.
Well, we know that can't be tested. Gerry?
Yeah.
I'm going to take issue with some of what's being said, partly because my problem is, if this was a black swan event, which you can argue whether it should have been or it shouldn't have been, can we all agree on this panel that it's not likely to stop? The numbers are likely to increase. And what are the solutions to deal with that? Because otherwise we're essentially debating whether a decision was made, whether people were ready, whether the right procedures were followed. Who cares? What's the next set of challenges that we have to get ready for? And I'm not sure, maybe we don't all agree, maybe it's going to suddenly stop, or are there going to be more and more migrants, and are we going to have to start?
And to your point, according to the UN, there are 1.5 billion, 2 billion people in Africa in 2015. There will be 2.4 billion in 2030. Unless you have the African Renaissance, which doesn't seem very likely and pretty soon, that which looks like an arrow pointing up to Europe is an arrow pointing up to Europe as to where those people are going to be moving. You have to assume that this is a permanent, I could be wrong. Is it permanent or not permanent? Do we agree?
It's not just permanent. I think you're going to have many millions more migrants coming, but the way the narrative needs to change is we need those migrants. Europe needs the immigration. I mean, the Commission did a study 3 years ago, if I remember the numbers right. The EU needs net immigration of 2.5 million people per year just to be able to sustain the worker to dependency ratio that we have right now. There have been no political leaders who have been willing to make that point or make that statement and state it. And if you look at the microcosm of Brexit, the Brexit debate, here we are with the British government trying to squeeze into 6 weeks the case of why immigration actually, maybe if not even, is good. That we have the immigrants who've come to the UK contributing more net to the exchequer than they're taking out, doing a lot of the jobs, the type of work in hospitals, in caring for elderly populations you need. That discussion has not happened and needs to take place. But if you've got to create the breathing space for that, is my only point. And to the extent that the deal with Turkey is meant to include the equal number of immigrants being brought in for every person who's sent out, if that happens, then you can start to change the narrative. You will take in as many people as would have come, but you're doing it through a system that isn't smugglers taking people in boats. If you do that, you lose the democratic argument.
But they have to smuggle them across in the first place to be sent back and then sent to Europe. That's what's so absurd about it.
There's a question and a microphone back there.
Yeah, that's good. I want to be challenged.
Yes, good morning. My name is Dionysios Kodelas. I'm retired ambassador. I'm president of the Special Olympics Hellas. My question goes to Mr. Rhodes and his analysis about, the Islam, the extreme Islam, and how can actually Muslims and Christians can live together in a rather long-term period. I have the experience, Mr. Rhodes, of the Arab world because I spent 8 years in the Middle East, in the Maghreb. It is true what you say that you can find, of course, a lot of Arabs who are well-educated people. You can discuss with them philosophy about everything. Nevertheless, there is a point where I think the religion is coming in. And I mean in the everyday issues like, for instance, the question of what happens in a mixed marriage. How do a Christian and a Muslim can live together, what their children will become, which religion they focus. So my question is whether you think that it is realistic to believe that in the long term there can be a coexistence of these two different religions in an environment like the European one, where we have already noticed that for many decades, where we have a lot of immigrants, they live together.
Why do we get Kurd?
Yes. This is my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And indeed, part of that question really is, are the refugees going to change Europe, or is Europe going to change the refugees, or some combination of both? And can you imagine that in, about 30 seconds?
30 seconds. I'll try 29 seconds. I'll give an example that will point us in the direction of further discussion. Prior to 2000, the young Muslims in America, and to a great extent in the UK, as they live in a liberal democratic society, their ideas about people's rights, separate from their religious convictions, was growing. Once the crises of the beginning 2000s happened, then everybody retreated into their various corners and started rebuilding ideas that were going to make it hard to have fruitful discussions. It has been possible to have very fruitful dialogue, conversations, and relationships with Muslims and Christians, especially over issues that, if we look at Lebanon, where you have the Christian, Muslim, and Jews in the past, and you have different kinds of Muslims who do intermarry, who do share families. The Balkan areas were to a great extent in Yugoslavia that way, and that was one of the things that ripped people apart. So the fact that people can cross these ideological and religious barriers is part of the anguish of these great conflicts in the past decade and a half. So it's like orange juice. It's not for everybody. Some people prefer tea, but it is possible, and there are examples of it.
I know no one who doesn't like orange juice. There's a question right there. Sweet.
Markos, professor and chairman of the Mediterranean Information Office for Environment, Culture and Sustainable Development, which is the federation of the NGOs of the Mediterranean, North and South. In the discussion, I think we started by the assumption that all solutions can be found from the activities in Greece or in Europe. I think there are two important components that were not raised. Can we learn from the past? My thesis is only partly, because today we have 8 million, in 60s we had 3 million. The ratio between Europeans and the rest was quite different, and we have a case there. The second is to what extent symbols play a role. In my visits in the region in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you had only a small percentage of veiled women in the Arab countries. Now you have them all veiled. Radical or not, what people in Europe observe is a mixture of what they, not the educated, not the well-prepared, and among them also politicians, they see it as an invasion. At the same moment, they see an economic crisis. They cannot make the distinction between these things. And we have to see the combined effect and to what extent upstream initiatives outside Europe can help in dealing with the overgrowth or overpopulation, and also in accepting, perhaps we have to start understanding that Europe will change, should change, and accept in the majority of their women around a big percentage of veiled women. Are we prepared for that? Are we ready to educate ourselves for that? If we are not, some of the solutions proposed until now have no future.
I think thank you for that. I think as Robin said, however we got here, clearly in a perfect world, you need some time to adjust all over the place. I would argue Europe could use a foreign policy, for example. I would also argue that the US has an enormous role to play that we've not been playing. If I was living in any of these 15 countries that are, 20 countries that are sending refugees north, I'd be coming north. Most of you would be coming north. The question is, are we going to commit to trying to change any of those conditions? I'd argue, I'm skeptical. There is a UN summit on refugees in September. One can at least be hopeful that the UN understands these are issues that need to be addressed, are going to try to bring people together, and start with what we don't have, which, what are the rules of the road? We lack rules of the road globally accepted, and perhaps that'll happen in September. I'm a confirmed skeptic. There's a question and a microphone over there. Yes, sir. Please.
Yeah, my name's Ian Brown from Salzburg Global Seminar. I wanted to thank the panel for their concentration on these issues of the societal narrative, which I think in the conversations, at least that I've had, have been particularly prominent. I wanted to ask, as I think many of the panelists have pointed out, that civil society has an important role in addressing these questions of, you know, what is European society, how do we control the situation at hand, how manageable is it, and what are the potential benefits? What role do you see the media playing in this? Because at least from my own perspective, they seem to have perhaps amplified more the uncontrollability and the problems involved more than they have the potential.
To bifurcate that, you're asking both what role are they playing and what role should they be playing?
Yes.
Does anyone want to take a whack at it? Joel?
Just a really quick point. You know, I think the media actually has has two sides to it.
Social media.
In one way, the media is serving consumers and thinks about the people who watch, listen, or read their content as consumers. I do think that one element that we probably all share here is we see another dimension, which is all of us as citizens. Citizens of our country, but probably also citizens of the world, to use the cosmopolitan theme. So it's just something to bear in mind, and I do think we see something playing out there where big sections of the media are thinking about the audience purely as consumers, where there's another dimension that needs to be brought in.
That said, we all saw, because of the media, that famous, infamous picture of the boat a couple weeks ago tipping over and people literally falling into the ocean. The question isn't, did the media play their role? The question is, why wasn't there outrage around the world that no one reacted to that picture in any way that I know of, at the government level, at the private level? Nothing changed. Remember the picture a couple years ago with the dead baby? And supposedly this was going to be the social media moment, which, oh my God, everyone will understand this is a crisis. Nah, came and went, lots of other pictures. Marietta, we need hope.
I do believe, I think that civil society, the media and the politicians all have a responsibility to contribute to changing the discourse. Words do matter. The photos and the images we project do matter. We have to go out of this burden sharing, migrants, refugees, and talk about humans and start projecting positive images of these people of success, because there are also lots of images of success. It's not about burden, it's about opportunity. So I do think that if we all take a share in explaining this, be more vocal and be more vocal against of what should not be happening, we have a great chance all together to re-establish the hope. My organization had to change the way we normally work, and that was because on European soil we found a lot of difficulties in carrying out the humanitarian work we do, lots of abstraction by the state. Because we saw that the only way to influence was to raise our voice. So, for example, We went quite far in advocating against policies that is not necessarily something that has been the case for all the other places where we work. And we also started working very, very closely with volunteers and civil society initiatives. That again is not something that we do in other places in the world. And I do think everybody has to change, not changing and just freezing everything or turning our back away is not a solution. So I want to object to yours and Jacob's statement that there could have been no other solution. We do not have time to lose. We should have started doing this long time ago. So every second counts, and there is time to, but we need to act quick to change the discourse.
And I think that's a terribly important point. The notion of changing the narrative has come up a couple times. Burdened opportunity, maybe it is economics. I actually think technology has a role to play, which works in the other direction, but that's a different issue. But burdened opportunity, I think, is terribly important. There's time for one last question.
Setting the example, sorry. We have to set examples. Only by setting the example will make other countries, do and reproduce the positive example instead of a negative one.
Which reminded me of the other thing you said a moment ago that I think is terribly important, and it is part of this, what is the role of philanthropy going forward? You've just said it. Everybody's going to have to change, and I suspect philanthropy, at its broadest definition, is going to take a much more aggressive role. It isn't about them all figuring it out and what space is left for philanthropy. It's rather, they've left all of this space, and it's up to philanthropy, broadly defined, to begin moving, civil society to begin moving, as you all have done. There's people all, I'm not in charge of the clock. They're waving at me back there.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you all the panelists. This has been a great discussion. I do think that this is a political problem, nothing more, nothing less. I am surprised that everyone feels surprised from the way the public has reacted to this. If you look through massive population movements throughout history, when they're sudden, that's what happens. People react to them exactly the same way. We are afraid of them. That's a fact of human nature. What troubles me is why, given the fact that this has been playing out for a while now, we are aware of the fact that there are massive population movements in the making, 60, 70 million people, not only because of conflicts, but for environmental reasons as well. Why are not governments reacting? Are they simply unprepared? Are they incompetent? Is there a lack of leadership? I don't necessarily buy that. But are they really seeing something else that is playing out slowly that they're really afraid of? Are they seeing massive demographic shifts in the future that they don't really know how to face? Having gone through, open markets, glorifying globalization, having seen all these things not really solved all the problems that we hoped that they were going to solve, are they now facing something that may change the character of these countries for the long run that are really afraid of? Or are they simply incompetent, which I don't believe?
I think we are out of time, but it's your clock. And I think the answer to that is yes. And people may disagree, but I think we would all share the notion that we're on the cusp of some just dramatic changes in the globe, in how the global system works. We're in major changes in how global economies interact. We clearly have climate change. Most of what we know over the last 50 years is beginning to change at a very fast pace, and it's not surprising at all that governments like to make America great again, for example. Mm-hmm. We want to go back to something we remember as safer, better, easier, of course. That doesn't allow us to answer any of the issues that we have all put on the table, and since we are out of time, last urgent thing you have to share.
No, I just want to, one thing, I mean, the problem actually is that governments are acting in Europe, but they're acting nationally, and they're acting in one way only, which is to increase the barriers very dramatically, which basically prevents the opportunity for Robin laying out that you need to have some sort of legalized framework with which you can bring migrants in. You may run the risk of not even having that.
I want to make one point just on Andreas's question earlier on about the role of philanthropy. I'm not involved in the same way, but it strikes me this area between what governments do and what philanthropists do is a really difficult, because you don't want to take over the role of government. The two spaces that strike me, or maybe they're interlinked, as absolutely critical are supplementing education, so language, that ability that means that the new generation that come in, the kids, the children of immigrants or refugees, are not disadvantaged and pulled off and left into that space where you then play to the negative narrative of what these people are. And the other part, which is the same, is transitions to work. There's some great work done by philanthropies trying to connect immigrants or refugees, whichever space we're in here, into work. So I think the work element and aspects of supplementing education, trying to be the bridge while governments catch up. And yes, they shouldn't be catching up, they should have been ready, but they're governments, and you know, governments are slow. I mean, that's what they do.
But there is another issue which Marietta has brought up, and their organization has been willing to take an enormous risk and say this is wrong. And I think that is a role that philanthropy has not traditionally played, and it's interesting that you've been prepared to do. Myrto, last question. Last comment, rather.
Yes, one comment about the role that philanthropy has been playing and how it's been, I mean, we all talk about how foundations work and how collaboration between foundations is critically important. I think in this particular case, it's even more so. We're talking about programs, initiatives that are dealing with the same problem across the spectrum, essentially with the same population names, so people moving from Greece to Germany, let's say. So we have so many more lessons to learn from foundations. I'm sure you can testify to that, from the experience of other foundations, NGOs between themselves, foundations collaborating more closely in this particular issue, I think is even more critical.
Joe, I lied. You get the last word. The question, yeah, I'd like you to comment. Ethics, morality has sort of floated through all this. But it clearly hasn't been a driving force of what's been going on. How you've spent your life thinking about that issue. Is there any chance, it goes back to your hope question, is there any chance to get people to look at those pictures and say, we've got to do something different?
I think so, and I'm glad that you brought it together, because I think often ethics is misunderstood as being just purely altruism, you know, purely charity. But actually sort of inspired by sort of the classical understanding of ethics. Ethics is about human flourishing, and it's about how to live well. And part of that is obviously our relation to others. One can't even understand one's own self or one's own interests unless one understands his or her relationship with other people. And so this problem, while it may seem out there or might seem something to be kept at bay, it's really about us, it's really about ourselves. And to use the language of politics, there is some self-interest in handling this problem or addressing this problem. Just very briefly, it was mentioned before, the ecological crisis in the Mediterranean, right? Does anyone really think that's an intractable problem? Well, it's a difficult problem, it's a collective action problem, it's very hard to deal with. But it's in each group's and each individual's self-interest to get this thing cleaned up so that we can live in a clean environment. Well, the refugee issue is not unlike that. We're sort of all in this together. And so it's not something to be seen as just perhaps altruistic or humanitarian, but there's some self-interest as well. And I think when those two things come together, there is some hope that people can sort of, as they say, do the right thing.
Our goal in this session was to have a conversation, and I think we did that. I want to thank all of you for first listening, second asking, and third for continuing the conversation, because this was intended to start something, not end something. So over the course of the next 2 days, I'm sure everyone here would be delighted to continue this conversation, as would I. So again, thank all of you very much, and thank you.